Oh, it's a better voice than mine, that wasn't it?
This meeting is being recorded. Hello.
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 Hello. Got a bit of a real desperation in our reading today, haven't we?
We have. It's pretty brutal.
It's pretty brutal. Do you want to read it, Mr. Grass?
Off with his head.
Hang on. God, that's quick. No banter, no hello. Just crack on.
Well, you know, after the night, after last night and all that went on, you know,
Was there football last night?
We're so excited.
Some football.
We're so excited, aren't we? Apparently, football's coming home. I don't know where he's coming home to or where he ever went to.
Oh, there was a fabulous interview with Kasper Schmeichel about, does he think football's coming home? And he went, has it ever come home? Have you ever actually won the European Championship? I was like, this is very true.
I thought it was very interesting yesterday. A Danish newspaper paid for a page in the Sun.
Good.
And said, football's never coming home. You know, it's coming back to Denmark. So the Sun hired a paper in the same Danish paper, which showed a picture of a bacon sandwich and said, and we're eating you for breakfast. Which is good banter, isn't it? Badinage, that's the word.
A lot of badinage.
Yeah, that our dear sister Debs taught us yesterday. Badinage, that's the word, isn't it? Plenty of it.
That was still a word that I hadn't heard of for 55 years. And I'm still not convinced it's not a word, or it is a word.
Google it. Now you know how to say it. I Googled it before I completely understood how it was spelled. But badinage.
Yeah. Yeah, it's French.
Banter, basically.
French, isn't it?
I assume so.
It's French for waste of time language or something, or words, something like that.
Well, perhaps we won't use it then. Isn't that what we call a sermon?
That's a sermon. Some people's sermons, when they write them, not everyone writes them, it appears, these days. They leave it to the congregation to
I've done it 2 weeks in a row now. Have you had feedback?
I have.
I love the fact they assume I've not written this.
Across.
Sorry?
It's a new style I've not come across.
Yeah, I've done it twice now.
Congregation to tell you the sermon.
Yeah, basically. It works brilliantly, to my mind. But I imagine there's a diversity of opinion in the congregation as time.
Definitely diversity, I think is the word.
I love the fact that I've only heard all the good stuff and they saved the moans for David.
Oh, but it's the same as with me, isn't it? They tell me what they want me to, but then I'll tell you the other stuff. So, okay.
Well, it's fine. They haven't got me on Sunday, so they'll get a different style again. So it's all
yeah, they will. I'm going to do exactly the same, I think. Try that.
You just get them to comment on it. But it isn't, of course. Well, anyway. You're still required to write a sermon because you've got to be in that passage. Because if you're going to open it up to, what's intriguing you about this passage, you have to be on what they might come back with because you need to have something to say about it. So you have to have done the prep anyway. You can't just, I haven't just walked in and gone, you tell me what, and I'm not saying anything. So anyway, but it's interesting.
So let's find out what might stimulate us about the gospel passage for Sunday.
Yeah, should have a pause.
Is that a link for a pause?
Let's go for a pause. Would you like to read today's reading, Chris?
I will do. It's a reading about the death of John the Baptist.
Can get right even this time, but carry on.
King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said it is Elijah, and others said it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, "It is not lawful to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man. And he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it." And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half my kingdom." She went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" She replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with order to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb.
Horrid stuff, isn't it? It's really
Lovely
horrible
stuff, isn't it?
I decided not to do this passage with our all-age congregation on Sunday because we like to have an activity to do alongside it, and I didn't think decorating cakes with a face on and putting them on paper plates would be suitable. So we've had to change the passage. It's too tough to do well, to my mind, it's a bit hard to do with an all-age congregation.
Just pretend it's Halloween.
It's true. Just beheading's a tough old thing. I guess, history. We're down with Henry VIII's queens being beheaded, so maybe we're okay with it. But
Yeah.
I just my first thought there was this little girl, whatever age she is, I'm guessing late teens, I don't know. She was quite happy to be given somebody's head and just carry it in. Utterly gruesome. I mean, we wouldn't quite be like that today, I don't think, would we?
I hope not.
Or are we just disjointed from the realities of life for many people that this is normal?
I don't know, when there were lots of ISIS beheadings on YouTube, or, they were not necessarily on YouTube, but videos of that, that for me was always the thought that if you wanted to go looking for it, you wouldn't have very far to find it, which, you would choose not to look at those things. But for some people, that level of violence is a complete reality in their life, and we probably do need to appreciate that.
Quite interesting. We were talking before we came online, dear listener, about how sometimes we are quite horrified by things and we want to stand up and do something, but well, as Joe said, we almost feel quite impotent. We're not quite sure what we can do or how to do it or how to protest. And yet here's a guy, John the Baptist, he did stand up and protest and say, hang on, this is wrong. Mm. And
didn't end well.
Didn't go down well at all.
I always find it very intriguing in this passage that Herodias, the woman, is the one holding the power at this point, because she's manipulating her daughter to get what she wants. Because we hear earlier on that Herodias hated John because he'd called her out on her illicit sexual practices. And so she was looking for a way to get rid of him. And so when Herod, being very foolish, offers that promise to Salome, I assume it is, but yes, to her daughter, there's an opportunity for her to manipulate, isn't it? And to get what she wanted.
Yeah, because it's not just, it's not just that bit of the daughter going to Herodias and saying, what should I ask for? she's manipulated and contrived that whole situation.
Yeah. Yes, because she's used her daughter to please the king in the first place, whatever that may mean.
And it might well mean that Herodias had also manipulated Herod to go on, reward her.
It's a grim story, isn't it?
It's a grim story. And we normally preach a gospel of love.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. We were always taught at college where, what's God up to in this passage? Where's Jesus?
Well, I think I'd probably be quite blunt and say, look, Jesus was highlighting incorrect, immoral, evil situations. And when we're incorrupt and evil and turned our back on God, this is the result. Even those godly people that might make us feel guilty, because we often meet people who don't say things, but we just know by their nature and who they are, make us feel guilty for something and make us realise how inadequate we are. And I'm guessing Herodias just couldn't cope with the guilt of, her guilt had been highlighted. She'd been called out, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the world turns against the good.
David, you're very quiet.
I was enjoying listening to your discussion. I thought it was very interesting. Yeah, it's a nasty passage or a nasty story, but the reality of life in those days, as you quite rightly highlighted about the ISIS beheadings, in parts of the world, nasty things happen because there are nasty people. And Herod, we know, was such a weak character anyway. He could be manipulated by anybody, and he always turned, ultimately, as did the longer generational family, they all turned to extreme violence of killing each other. So to have John the Baptist's head cut off was, second nature almost to Herod and his.
It's taken me to on Radio 4 yesterday and on BBC News. They were interviewing Mina Smallman, whose daughters were killed last year in the park by a man who was clearly very disturbed and making pacts with what he called the devil. And Mina and I were curates together in London as she was ordained with me in St Paul's Cathedral. And she had there was this amazing grace and strength of her talking about confronting that level of awful violence in her life and the life of her family, and the dreadful details that they've had to go through in the court, and just that awful, which we can hardly even begin to imagine, the pain of knowing that suffering, and that even through all of that, her faith still gives her the strength to be able to forgive the man who perpetrated the violence, and to see, quite astoundingly described that even in that awfulness for her, the gift, and that was the word she used, the gift was that he had set out to sacrifice 6 women, and because he was caught after the death of those 2 women, her description was their sacrifice saved 4 further women from being killed. And that frames violence and suffering in such a different way, doesn't it? To have that grace and love and faith, even in the midst of such horror. Really quite astounding to hear her speak.
And I think that's one of the things in that story. And I remember hearing the Bishop of Stafford, Gordon Mersall, once preach on this. And he touched on a very similar thing to what you're saying, Joe, and that is that amidst all of the story and the gore and the brutality, nowhere is it mentioned that John the Baptist had a family.
Yeah, Elizabeth and John. And Zachariah, yeah.
You know, and nowhere has he mentioned that, you know, and or his friends or his disciples that he left behind. Nowhere did he nowhere is there a common past about how they must have been feeling or what their reactions were or what had happened. And it's a dreadful and an awful story, but it was part of reality of life, I think, of those days.
Well, and sadly now.
Yeah.
And you know, taking it back to Chris's point, you know, it is hard because the cost of speaking up and challenging evil and challenging nastiness and horror was John paying with his life. And, you know, I think Jesus, the whole story of Christ is about death and resurrection, isn't it? That's the whole heart of the gospel. But, you know, none of the disciples had a good end, really.
I think John seemed to escape it, didn't he, in his cave in Patmos? He lived quite close, yeah. He got away with it a bit.
But lots of them were killed for their faith, weren't they? And,
yeah.
And quite brutally so.
Yeah.
And still are today in parts of Africa and Asia. You know, Christians are being killed for their faith because it doesn't agree with the rule of other, you know, traditions or ways of being. And what would Jesus have done? Well, we know what Jesus would have done. First of all, he'd have spoken to the woman who'd been doing wrong in this story. Because what did he do when he encountered that before? He said, righto, you know what's right, you know what's wrong, go away and don't do it again.
But isn't that what John had said? That's why she was feeling so guilty.
Yeah, John's done exactly the same.
You know, John's done, go away and don't do it again. And she felt guilty because she didn't want to stop.
Yeah, and it's you know, I genuinely think we've got to consider how do we encourage ourselves and our congregations and our communities to be good role models and to speak out against injustice, even when we know that the cost of that is high. And it's unlikely to result in our death, really, for us. But I guess it could, but it's less likely. But it's likely to result in us being unpopular, being talked about, being written off as stupid, or actually that, you know.
Yeah, but I think sometimes if you deeply believe it, you have to have the courage of your conviction, don't you? And you have to be prepared to speak out, as we do, I think, and often, you know, we voice that. And I had a good friend I used to work with many years ago called Ian McLaughlin. He was one of the only defrocked Hell's Angels I know that ever lived to tell the tale. But he used to always say that, look, life isn't a popularity contest. Sometimes you have to stand up and speak out. And I think the point you're making, how do we talk about things that are wrong? And we were talking off recording earlier, as Chris alluded to earlier. We were talking about so many things that are wrong in the world and in society that need putting straight in some way. But the church, in many ways, as Chris said, has been sidelined as being unimportant, you know, irrelevant to the situation, when actually the relevance we have is profound because of what Jesus teaches us and tells us to do.
Yeah. So when we also were talking about how the gospel is radical, it's revolutionary and radical because it is talking about, you know, the poor being raised up. It's talking about forgiveness and mercy. It's talking about justice. It's talking about holy living and respecting our promises and taking care of each other and honouring our wedding vows and all the things that, you know, are perhaps not, we don't see so much in our society now. And those values are important. So, you know, when we hear of extremely tight rules against asylum seekers and offshore detention centres and the fact that we might be arrested for helping people who are in need or denied the right to peaceful protest, then actually we should be saying something about those things because it's important.
Yep.
There we are. We've said something about all the things we talked about.
Yeah. But here we are in sleepy Dorset, where we're not affected directly often by a lot of these, only through press or news, and you can choose to ignore that or turn it off, can't you? If you feel uncomfortable watching something happen, you turn the telly off and put on, the Masked Singer or something, whatever that may be.
Or the football. But yeah.
Oh yes, no, that's a different reason, because actually, the all of this could well be saved by the well-known saviour Gareth. Archangel Gareth is coming down to save everything on Sunday afternoon or evening, even.
Evening, 8 o'clock kickoff.
8 o'clock kickoff Sunday evening. So, viewer, if you are an ardent Evensong supporter at 6:30, you'll still be home in time to watch it. Don't ring the vicar and ask him to change the time of the service.
But we might be sensible and only preach for 10 minutes instead of our normal half an hour, so that we can get home as well.
Well, you're not a short change, aren't they, Chris? Half an hour, that's all you give them.
I thought your attitude was, aren't my lot of short change because they got me instead of you?
What?
No, well, it's my congregation is short change because I make them do the sermon instead of me.
Exactly. In fact, poor congregational viewer, if you do feel shortchanged, tell us. We'll have a swap round perhaps one week. We'll do the old-fashioned pulpit swap. We'll go. I'll come down to your parishes, Chris, and you can do my 4 services in the morning and so on. It'll be good fun.
It'll be good fun, won't it?
It will be good fun. It will be. So there we are. So we haven't been able to put the world right. We weren't able to soothe the brow of John the Baptist family, maybe. But the importance is we should stand up as Christians against all that we know that is wrong and immoral in the world. And we shouldn't be afraid to speak out, even if we could be arrested, because even if we're arrested, the likelihood of our heads being chopped off is fairly short.
There we have it. It's been lovely spending time with you again.
It has.
You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter at Beaminster Team, or on our website, beaminsterteamchurches.org, or you can go and find us on
the Eggardon Colmers Benefice Facebook page, eggardoncolmerschurches.org website.
And we'd love to hear from you and see you. See you again next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.